Okay, this is Drama 203, Section 1, and today's video lecture consists of three parts. In the first part, I want to go back to Shakespeare's Twelfth Night and focus on Act 5, Scene 1, the final scene in the play, the scene in which Shakespeare brings together all of the plot lines that he's been developing over the course of the narrative, and where each of those plot lines reaches its resolution. Before we dive back into the play, I want to quote a passage from the source for the main plot. I talked about Shakespeare's sources in my first lecture on Twelfth Night. Remember, for the subplot, there is no source. The subplot that involves Sir Toby Belch, Sir Andrew Aguecheek, Maria, Festi, and Malvolio, that's Shakespeare's invention. He came up with that story himself. The main plot, however, is an adaptation of Barnaby Rich's tale, Apollonius and Scylla. This tale was first published in 1581. It appeared in this collection of prose narratives by Rich titled Rich, His Farewell to Military Profession, containing very pleasant discourses fit for a peaceable time. And Apollonius and Scylla is the second tale in this collection. Apollonius is the character in Rich's story who would become Duke Orsino in Twelfth Night. Scylla is the Viola character. Silvio is the Sebastian character. And Giulietta is the Olivia character. And what I want to read from is the second last paragraph of Apollonius and Scylla, where the twins reunite. Now, there are many differences between the original story and Shakespeare's adaptation in Twelfth Night. One of the most significant differences is that in the original story, it's not the case that either twin thinks the other has died. Remember, that's one of the most compelling dramatic elements of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Viola goes through much of the play disguised as her brother, Sebastian, calling herself Cesario, but wearing the clothes of Sebastian, believing that Sebastian perished in the shipwreck that occurred just before the commencement of the action in the play. Sebastian, who's also washed up on the shore of Illyria, befriended Antonio, likewise believes that he lost his beloved twin sister Viola. And it's only in the final scene that they come together. Well, the source material is different. In the source, what the Scylla character is revealed to be a woman, and her master Apollonius, the Orsino character, proposes to her, and their impending marriage becomes the news of the land. And this is what happens. The matter, the revelation of Scylla's identity and their impending marriage, the matter seems so wonderful and strange that the bruit, the news, was spread throughout all the parts of Greece, in so much that it came to the hearing of Silvio, the Sebastian character, who, as you have heard, remained in those parts to inquire of his sister. He, being the gladdest man in the world, hasted to Constantinople, where, coming to his sister, he was joyfully received and most lovingly welcomed and entertained of the Duke, his brother-in-law. So that's Rich's account of the reunion between the twins. A little bit of background on the Silvio character. And as I said, at no point does he believe that his sister has died, but he does hear she's having all sorts of adventures in Constantinople. So he goes looking for her. When he arrives in Constantinople, he can't find Scylla. He does run into Giulietta. Giulietta, believing he is the Duke's page with whom she has fallen in love, seduces him. They have a one-night stand. Giulietta becomes pregnant. Silvio leaves Constantinople to search for his sister elsewhere, and all sorts of chaos ensues until the very end of the story when Scylla's true identity is revealed. Silvio returns to Constantinople and ends up marrying Giulietta, while Apollonius and Scylla, the Orsino and Viola characters, marry as well. So that, but that reunion scene, a single sentence in Barnaby Rich. Look at what Shakespeare does with this reunion between the two twins that he's renamed Viola and Sebastian. Just taking us now, page 871 in the Norton Anthology, this moment when the comedy potentially turns to tragedy. Uh, Orsino arrives at Olivia's house. Olivia announces, I've married Cesario. We know that she didn't marry Cesario, she married Sebastian. And we have this heated exchange between Orsino and Olivia, and between Orsino and Viola. Viola, at long last, professes her love for the Duke. When the Duke is going to leave, very angrily and bitterly leaving, believing that Olivia has married his page, Viola, still in the disguise of Cesario, tells Olivia that this is at line 133, that she is going after him I love, more than I love these eyes, more than my life, more than all the mores that e'er I shall love wife. But once, so she finally admits her love, but it may be too late. The priest has arrived on stage, and he has said that Cesario, only a few hours earlier, married Lady Olivia. Orsino believes this, and he rejects his servant at line 163 as a dissembling cub. He says at line 167 to Viola, Cesario, who he believes to be his page Cesario, farewell, and take her, take Olivia, but direct thy feet where thou and I henceforth may never meet. So all seems to be lost. Again, this is the moment when the comedy almost turns to tragedy, but for Sebastian's timely appearance, which brings about the happy ending. The faith that Viola has put in time throughout this play is rewarded. I mentioned at the end of last day's lecture that in comedy, characters have a habit of arriving in the nick of time, whereas in tragedies, as we saw in particular in Sophocles' Antigone, as we know from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the characters often arrive just too late. Well, we get the recognition scene. It's one sentence in Barnaby Rich's Apollonius and Scylla. It takes up, 20 to 30 lines in Shakespeare's play, and it's among the most moving sequences in any of Shakespeare's comedies and in any of his plays. Viola and Sebastian finally come face to face and realize that neither has been lost to death. Sebastian says at line 225, do I stand there? Because of course Viola is dressed as Sebastian. Do I stand there? I never had a brother, nor can there be that deity in my nature of here and everywhere. I can't be split into two people. That doesn't happen in real life. It only happens in stories. I had a sister, Sebastian continues, whom the blind waves and surges have devoured. Of charity, what kin are you to me? He asks this woman before him, this woman dressed as a man. What countryman? What name? What parentage? Viola responds, of Messalene, Sebastian was my father. Such a Sebastian was my brother too. So he went suited, the way I'm dressed, to his watery tomb. If spirits can assume both form and suit, you come to fright us. Line 234. So it's this absolute marvelous moment, this undeniably poignant moment. Sebastian then responds, a spirit I am indeed, but am in that dimensions grossly clad. I'm human, which from the womb I did participate. Were you a woman, as the rest goes even, I should my tears let fall upon your cheek and say, thrice welcome, drowned Viola. Viola then says, my father had a mole upon his brow, Sebastian, and so had mine, Viola, and died the day when Viola from her birth had numbered 13 years. Sebastian, oh, that record is lively in my soul. I remember it well. He finished indeed his mortal act that day that made my sister 13 years. Viola, if nothing lets to make us happy both, but this, my masculine usurped attire, the fact I'm dressed as a man, do not embrace me till each circumstance of place, time, fortune do cohere and jump, that I am Viola, which to confirm I'll bring you to a captain in this town, where lie my maiden weeds, by whose gentle help I was preserved to serve this noble count. All the occurrence of my fortune since hath been between the lady and this lord. And so the twins are reunited in this play where appearance often does not match up to a reality, in this play where people lose their identities and gain new identities. Here in this most touching scene, appearance is reality. I mentioned at the end of last day's lecture that Shakespeare was the father of twins, a twin boy and girl, Hamnet and Judith. And Hamnet died at age 11 in 1596, 4 or 5 years before Shakespeare wrote this play. Well, Orsino, watching this reunion, observing it, trying to figure out what's going on, why there are two Ciceros in front of him, says at line 264, if this be so, if you are indeed twins, and the male page that I have been coming so close to over the last 3 months is actually a woman, a young woman, Viola. He says, if this be so, as yet the glass, the seeming illusion of two Ciceros in front of me, seems true, I shall have share in this most happy rack. So these developments lead Orsino to finally reveal his feelings for Cicerio, his boy page, who is really Viola, this young lady. He asks Viola, this is at line 266, boy, thou hast said to me 1,000 times, thou never should love woman like to me. And Viola replies, and those sayings will I overswear, and all those swearings keep as true in soul, as doth the orbed continent, the sun, the fire that severs day from night. She loves this guy. At times we wonder why she loves him, but Orsino is the first love and seemingly the great love of Viola's life. He proposes marriage. Viola, as Orsino puts it, will become her master's mistress. And so it's a very funny and intriguing way to end the story. But there's also in this plot twist the culmination of the character growth that Orsino has been undergoing throughout the story. In proposing to Viola, he abandons his immature pursuit of Olivia, someone he doesn't even see as a real person. Remember, he's the Petrarchan lover, and he glorifies, idealizes Olivia as this perfect being, a goddess that he pursues with such great passion. He gives that up at the end. He gives that up for Viola, someone he's gotten to know over time as a person, albeit in the disguise of his male page Cicerio. We also learn that Sir Toby and Maria have married, and this is at line 359. Fabian, the friend of Sir Toby, offers the following report as he's describing the truth behind the trick that they played in Malvolio. He says, Maria writ the letter, the letter that Malvolio believed to have been written by Lady Olivia. Maria writ the letter at Toby's great importance, in recompense whereof he hath married her. So a strange reason to marry someone, and yet we feel they belong together. Maybe Sir Toby will be a bit more responsible with the commonsensical headstrong, witty Maria as his wife. So through marriage, Maria, Sir Toby, Olivia, Sebastian, Viola, and Orsino, they all become one extended family as this play comes to a close. And yet, things in the conclusion can't seem to come together. Viola can't get her clothes back because the captain is imprisoned, right? So Viola, for the time being, must remain in her disguise as Cesario. She can't put back on the clothes of that she first wore when this play began, the clothes of Lady Violet. She remains Cesario. I think more seriously, there's this character of Antonio. Remember Sebastian's friend Antonio. It's unclear if Antonio will be punished for his actions against Illyria. He was this wanted pirate in Illyria, and he only entered the gates of Illyria and made himself publicly known to help the person he believed to be Sebastian, who was actually Viola disguised as Cesario. And as we see in the scenes between Sebastian and Antonio, it's pretty clear. It's not stated outright, but it seems pretty clear that Antonio has a crush on Sebastian. And this is one other relationship, romantic relationship that develops, a one-sided romantic relationship that develops in this story, a romantic relationship where Antonio has these homoerotic feelings for Sebastian. Quite daring on Shakespeare's part to include it in the story, but it's a story about all the different types of love, with a particular emphasis on unrequited love. And so with this character Sebastian, I think we get the sense, whether or not he's punished for his past actions as a pirate, he won't easily get over Sebastian. This is a love that will not be requited. And then, of course, there are the final 176 lines of the play. They deal with the resolution of the Malvolio subplot. He enters the stage freed from the dark house. He calls his imprisonment, at line 343, the most notorious geck and gull that ever invention, trickery played on. How could this have happened to him? What did he do to deserve this? For a moment, he even forgets that Olivia is his mistress, and he demands at line 344, tell me why. Tell me why this has happened. Because still at this point, he thinks that that letter that he came upon back in Act 2, the letter that fills him with this delusion that Olivia is actually in love with him, this letter that tells him to dress in such a ridiculously outlandish way, to act superior to Sir Toby and his friends, that this letter was indeed written by Olivia, when in fact it was a forgery by Maria. This is all part of a trick to humiliate him. And they did humiliate him. Arguably, they took it too far, because once Olivia believes that Malvolio's gone mad, they lock Malvolio in this dark house. And remember, Feste, pretending to be Sir Topas, comes to the door to take Malvolio's confession. Well, all the truth is revealed. The truth of the tricking of Malvolio is revealed by Fabian. And once Fabian is done telling the real story of what occurred, he says this at line 362. He says, how with a sportful malice it was followed, this gulling, this trick on Malvolio, how with a sportful malice it was followed, may rather pluck on laughter than revenge, if that the injuries be justly weighed that have on both sides passed. Lines 362 to 365. He's saying, we should just have a laugh about this, because we each party treated the other terribly, up until this point. And Feste at line 371 reminds Malvolio and reminds the audience that Malvolio in many respects, brought this fate upon himself. He says to Malvolio, "But do you remember? Madame, why laugh you at such a barren rascal, and smile not? And if you smile not, he's gagged." That is the very first lengthy speech of Malvolio in this entire play, where he's being so unnecessarily cruel to the clown Feste. And Feste reminds him of this, reminds Malvolio of his own words. And then Feste points out, "And thus the whirly-jig of time brings in his revenges." Well, Malvolio's final line is unforgettable. He says at line 373, "I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you." Earlier in the play, in Act 3, Scene 4, Sir Toby says of this trick that they are playing on Malvolio, "We may carry it, the trick, thus, for our pleasure and his penance." Well, by the time we get to the end of this play, and Malvolio learns the truth of what has occurred, and he's freed from his dark room where he's been judged insane, there's no sense that Malvolio is repentant over his past actions. There's no sense that Malvolio has seen the error of his ways. He now wants revenge as desperately as he once wanted power. After Malvolio makes his final exit, Orsino, wanting information about the captain who has Viola's true clothes and who has been imprisoned because of some action, as he puts it, on Malvolio's part, tells his men at line 376, "Pursue him and entreat him to a peace. Beg him to come, persuade him to come to terms with us." Well, given what we know about Malvolio, and given what we've seen that has happened in the course of this play, it's highly unlikely that Olivia's steward will be entreated to a peace. The great actor John Gielgud, who played Malvolio at the Old Vic Theatre in the 1940s, who then directed a version of Twelfth Night in the 1960s. John Gielgud said the following. He said, "It is so difficult to combine the romance of the play with the cruelty of the jokes against Malvolio. The different elements in the play are hard to balance properly." Of course, all these elements in the play are in the final scene, which really raises the question, why does Shakespeare choose to close the final scene on such a note of bitterness, right? Is Shakespeare even attempting to bring these elements into balance? And I'll let you ponder that question. I'll just add that you see in this play, and I think it becomes most evident in this final scene, that Shakespeare's working with different types of comedy. In the main plot, you have romantic comedy that one way or another ultimately drives back to the new comedy of the Romans, right? Plautus and Terence, who were adapting even the earlier writer, Menander, the Greek writer. And then with the romantic comedy, the main plot, you have it paired with satiric comedy in the subplot, satiric comedy which dates back to the Greek Old Comedy and Aristophanes. So Shakespeare is bringing these types of comedy together along with elements of tragedy, right? There are many tragic elements to this story, which I've touched on in previous lectures. And that leads us to the final speech of the play. In fact, it's a song. It's a song sung by Feste the Clown. Let's turn to that last bit of the play. And it's on page 875. And it serves as the epilogue. And Shakespeare, in 13 of his plays, concludes the dramatic spectacle with an epilogue, or one of the characters steps out of character, more or less, and addresses the audience. Well, Feste is the last character on stage, and he sings this song. Remember, Feste was played by the great actor Robert Armin, who specialized in the clown character, the jester character, and who was well known for being one of the great singers of his age. So it's a It's a 5 stanza song, and it goes as follows. When that I was and a little tiny boy, with hey ho, the wind and the rain, a foolish thing was but a toy, for the rain it raineth every day. But when I came to man's estate, with hey ho, the wind and the rain, gainst knaves and thieves men shut their gate, for the rain it raineth every day. But when I came, alas, to wive, with hey ho, the wind and the rain, by swaggering could I never thrive, for the rain it raineth every day. But when I come unto my beds, with hey ho, the wind and the rain, with tosspots still had drunken heads, for the rain it raineth every day. And I'll just go over those first 4 stanzas of this song. It's one of 3 songs that Feste sings in the play. We have that great Carpe Diem lyric early on, O Mistress Mine, one of the finest song lyrics that Shakespeare wrote in his career. We have in that amazing character building scene between Viola and Orsino when they have their discussion of love. We have it interrupted briefly and gloriously by still another song by Feste, O Come Death, this very sad and dark, melancholy song. And now we have this song, It Raineth Every Day, ending the play. And in the first 4 verses of the play, Feste presents the hard life of a hard luck rogue. You know, this is a song that seems replete with bitterness and disillusionment. The character in the song starts out a little tiny boy engaging in harmless mischief. He comes to man's estate and he's shut out of door, judged a knave and a thief. He marries, and as he says, despite his swaggering, his bullying, is apparently dominated by his wife. Finally, he grows old, as he puts it. I came onto my beds, and he's still a drunkard. So the song by Feste that concludes this play moves into the commonplace world. The world where, as the refrain states, the rain it raineth every day. And I think in that way, the song draws attention to the artificiality of the story, particularly the main plot line that we've just seen dramatized for us. At the same time, the song perhaps reminds us of the sadness underlying many of these scenes. Still, there's a sense of acceptance in the final lines of the song. Let's go to the 5th and final verse of It Raineth every day. A great while ago the world begun, with hey ho, the wind and the rain. But that's all one. Our play is done, and we'll strive to please you every day. So, what a conclusion. The final lines of this song suggest that we never encounter anything we haven't seen before. And so there's practically nothing we can't handle. So it ends on a sign, on a sentiment of hope. Hope amid the bitterness and disillusionment described in the previous 4 verses. I think these final lines also suggest, remember, he's addressing the audience. We the actors, will strive to please you every day. So these final lines also suggest, given the ugly realities of the world, the real world, the world outside the Globe Theatre, plays that please, plays that move and delight an audience, plays that make you laugh, do have an important function in life. And we, Feste is saying, Shakespeare is saying through Feste, we, the Chamberlain's men at the Globe Theatre, will strive to please you the next time you put down your penny to come and watch the performance of one of our plays. So it's a marvelous end to a marvelous play, one of Shakespeare's greatest romantic comedies, and I think made even greater because it incorporates genres that are normally outside of romantic comedy, like satiric comedy in the subplot and tragedy. as I've repeatedly noted, there in its tone and in many aspects of the story, there certainly is an aspect of tragedy in Twelfth Night. So we'll leave Twelfth Night for the time being, and in the next part of my lecture, I want to turn my attention to this question of genre and the mixing of genres, and sort of frame that examination of genre through the early modern literary theory, uh, the in other words, the theatrical criticism of the early modern period, the 15th century, the 16th century. So let's go back to the 15th century Italy, and back to the Renaissance humanists. In my first lecture on the early modern period, I discussed the emergence of Renaissance humanism. The Renaissance humanist, of course, was the student of ancient Greco-Roman learning and culture, and the first Renaissance humanists really made an impact on early modern Europe in Italy. Petrarch, much later Machiavelli, and so on. And as I noted in that lecture from a few weeks ago, the Renaissance humanists were deeply influenced by the Greek and Roman models of comedy, of tragedy, as well as of theatrical design, the design of the theaters. And this embrace of Greco-Roman culture led to the rebirth of secular playwriting in this time period, the period of early modern Europe. The Renaissance humanists were also influenced by Greco-Roman literary criticism. And on this front, two very important 16th century scholars were Julius Scaliger, who lived between 1484 and 1558, and Lodovico Casavetro, who lived between 1505 and 1571. In 1560, Scalinger's Seven Books of Poetics was published posthumously. In 1570, Calavestro translated Aristotle's Poetics into French. So both of these writers, both of these Renaissance humanists, used Aristotle's Poetics as their jumping off point. In fact, Scaliger called Aristotle, this is a quote from his Seven Books of Poetics, our emperor, dictator forever of all good qualities in the arts. And we looked at passages from Aristotle's Poetics. In the week we discussed Sophocles' Oedipus the King, which was Aristotle's all-time favorite play. So a copy of Aristotle's Poetics is rediscovered in the 15th century. It's translated into Latin. Eventually, it's translated into French, and it makes an impact. It makes an impact on the playwrights of the day and those who wrote about drama, including these scholars, Scaliger and Calavestro. Now, it's important to point out, though, when we look at the Renaissance humanists and what they did with Aristotle, it's important to point out, and this is a point made by Brian McCannahy, who is a theatrical scholar, Scaliger, Calavestro, like-minded humanists set out to update and in their minds improve upon Aristotle's recommendations for good drama. And that's why their scholarly pursuits are referred to as neoclassicism, new classicism, taking the ideas of the ancient Greco-Roman writers and updating them. So now going to genre and the question of dramatic genre. With respect to genre, these 16th writers turned not just to Aristotle, but also to the ancient Roman writer Horace. Horace wrote an influential book on poetry, Ars Poetica, The Art of Poetry. It was written in 13 BCE. And in that work, which was rediscovered in the early modern period and translated and promulgated by the Renaissance humanists, In that work, Horace writes the following, translated into English. The comic matter will not be expressed in tragic verse. No less Thyestes' feast, and that's one of the tragic stories from Greek mythology that was often adapted into tragic plays. Seneca did his version, a generation after Horace's time. Seneca did his story of his version of the story of Thyestes. Right, Thyestes is the uncle of Agamemnon. And so, classic tragic story. So he says, no less Thyestes' feast abhors low numbers, and the private strain, the stories of families, the stories of private life, fit for the sock. The sock is the symbol, the Greek symbol of comedy. Horace's point being, each subject, each genre should retain the place allotted it. Okay, that is one of the main points of Horace. So taking their cues from Aristotle as well as from Horace, the 15th and 16th century humanist critics who wrote on the theater insisted upon the rigid separation of tragedy and comedy. They saw generic purity as a defining characteristic of real art. Uh, and there were English neoclassicists as well. The best known piece of early modern literary criticism written in England, some of you may have heard about this book, perhaps read this book in an English class, The Defense of Poetry, probably written in 1579, published in 1595 after circulating widely in manuscript, written by Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was a soldier and statesman, as well as a poet and fiction writer. He wrote the sonnet collection Astrophel and Stella, which to me is the second best sonnet collection of early modern English writing, second only to Shakespeare's sonnets. He wrote the prose romance, The Arcadia, the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, which, like Barnaby Rich's His Farewell to His Profession, is a collection of interlocked prose narratives. But I mean, it's so much greater than Barnaby Rich. It's almost ridiculous to compare the two. The Arcadia is a magnificent work. In fact, Shakespeare got the subplot to King Lear from the Arcadia. Well, so Sidney wrote these great works of fiction, of poetry. He also wrote this treatise about literature. And very famously, or infamously, in the defense of poesy, for the most part, he's defending poetry and the various genres of literature, but there is one major form of literature that Sir Philip Sidney condemns. He condemns 16th century English commercial theater. And he condemns it chiefly on the grounds that its plays blend, intermix the genres. The passage from The Defense of Poesy reads as follows. But besides these gross absurdities, the English dramatist's tendency to switch locations over the course of a story and move ahead in time, Sidney didn't like that, and neither did the neoclassicists from Italy and France. I'll talk more about what are called the unities when we discuss Molière. But continuing with Sidney, how all their plays, he's saying this is the real problem with English drama these days. How all their plays be neither right tragedies nor right comedies, mingling kings and clowns, not because the matter so carrieth them, but thrust in the clown by head and shoulders to play a part in majestical matters, with neither decency nor discretion, so as neither the admiration and commiseration nor the right sportfulness is by their mongrel tragedy comedy obtained. A couple lines later he picks it up. So falleth it out that, having indeed no right comedy in that comical part of our tragedy, we have nothing but scurrility, unworthy of any chaste ears, and some extreme show of doltishness, indeed fit to lift up a loud laughter and nothing else, where the whole tracts of a comedy should be full of delight, as the tragedy should be still maintained in a well raised admiration. So he's saying here, it's not real drama if you don't keep the genres distinct. Right comedy and right tragedy, as he puts it, they don't go together. And Sidney was far from the only 16th century English writer to feel this way. George Whetstone was an author in the latter part of the 16th century. He wrote a work called Promos and Cassandra. In the prologue to that work, it was published in 1578, Whetstone excoriates popular playwrights who, as he puts it, make a clown companion with a king. There was another writer. His name was Joseph Hall. And Joseph Hall wrote a book, a neoclassical work, a work that adapted into English some of the poetic principles of the ancient Greeks and Romans. 1598, Virgilium it's called, and he urges the readers to shun the inartistic and subversive, as he puts it, hodgepodge of tragedy and comedy presented on the public stage. So Shakespeare and most of his playwriting contemporaries crafted dramas that are very much at odds with the prevailing literary criticism of the period. The neoclassical literary critics like Sidney, like Whetstone, like Hall, like Scaliger, Calavestro, the neoclassical critics were champions of elite art. The London playwrights, such as Shakespeare, created popular art. That's a very important distinction that is sometimes lost as the centuries have gone by and Shakespeare has been set up as this sort of as this figure of high culture, which he was not in his time period, for many reasons, including the fact that he brought together comedy and tragedy. He intermixed the genres. If we go to the Elizabethan stage, the late 16th century stage, even before Shakespeare, one of the earliest hit plays of this era was 1570, a play by Thomas Preston. And here's the title: A Lamentable Tragedy Mixed Full of Pleasant Mirth, containing the life of Cambyses, King of Persia. A play that was a big hit when it was first staged at the theater, at James Burbage Theater, that was revived many times over the decades that followed. Another highly successful and influential play was written by Robert Greene in 1589. It's called Friar Bacon and Friar Benjy. And this play combines comedy, romance, tragedy, and fantasy. A couple years later, 1591, 1592, one of the greatest tragic plays of this era of English theater, Christopher Marlowe's The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. This play has a comic subplot. It too mixes tragedy and comedy. John Lilly, who was a playwright, an English playwright who flourished in the 1580s. His career sort of came to an end as the 1580s became the 1590s. He wrote for the first children's companies that were headquartered at St. Paul's Cathedral. He wrote a number of great plays: Endymion, Midas. You know, he doesn't get as much attention as he deserves for his comedies. But he said this in the prologue to his 1589 comedy Midas. John Lilly wrote the following, using a culinary metaphor to describe the mingling of genres in his works and in the works of his contemporaries. He wrote, "What heretofore hath been served in several dishes for a feast is now minced in a charger for a gallifrey." So it's all mixed together. It's all mixed together. Thus, Shakespeare wasn't the first early modern dramatist to interweave serious and comic subject matter. Shakespeare arrives on the scene only 1590. However, to a greater degree than almost any of his peers, uh, he made this technique of mixing the genres, one of the defining qualities of his art. We go to Hamlet, you know, arguably Shakespeare's greatest tragedy. You know, I'd probably vote for King Lear, but on some days, Hamlet would take number one spot for me. Well, in Hamlet, Shakespeare seems to be making light of and expressing his relish for the hybrid nature of his medium. He has Polonius, this character Polonius, the Lord Chamberlain of Elsinore Castle, describe the visiting playing group. If you know Hamlet, there's a point in Act 3 in the play. Well, actually, it's the end of Act 2, and then this sort of part of the story really gets going in Act 3, where a troupe of players, of actors, come to Elsinore Castle, where the story is set. And before they arrive, Polonius describes them. He describes them as being the best actors in the world, either for tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral meaning stories that are set in the woods, pastoral, and then he continues, pastoral comical, historical pastoral, tragical historical, pastoral, tragical comical, historical pastoral, scene indivisible, or poem unlimited. And usually I think this is a moment, one of many moments actually in Hamlet, where Shakespeare is commenting on his own art, and he's glorying in the fact that yes, in his plays the genres are intermixed. Poem unlimited. I love that phrase. We move ahead to the 18th century, and Samuel Johnson. And Samuel Johnson in 1765 oversaw an edition of Shakespeare's works. Johnson was the lead editor, and for that collection, he wrote a preface called the Preface to Shakespeare. Portions of it are found in our text, the Norton Anthology. And 18th century, where these neoclassical rules continued to be upheld by many scholars and critics, Johnson felt he had to defend Shakespeare for mixing the genres. And so Johnson said this in his preface to Shakespeare. He observed that in their generic instability, Shakespeare's plays exhibit, as Johnson puts it, I love the way he puts this, the real state of sublunary nature. Sublunary meaning belonging to this world, right? Rather than the spiritual one, what is under the moon. The real state of sublunary nature, which partakes of good and evil, joy and sorrow, mingled with endless variety of proportion and innumerable modes of combination. This is how Johnson puts it. So Johnson is pointing out what I think is the truth, that that this isn't a defect in Shakespeare's art, the way he intermingles the genres. This is at the heart of what makes Shakespeare great. And I would also say many of the dramatists like John Lilly, Christopher Marlowe, who were Shakespeare's contemporaries, who did their work in the 16th century, the early 17th century. Well, the last part of today's lecture concerns the end of that era, the end of Shakespeare's theater, and basically the period from 1600 to 1642. I remember when I first began to fall in love with the works of Shakespeare, I resolved to myself, someday I'm going to go to England and I'm going to go to the Globe Theatre. where these plays were performed for the first time, in the early 17th century. And then I found out, the Globe Theatre doesn't exist. It hasn't. The original Globe Theatre hasn't existed since the middle of the 17th century. And my response is, well, how did that happen? Well, this is the story of how that happened. Uh, but before I tell that part of the story, a few points about the first 2 decades of the early 17th century and what unfolded on the English stage. Well, in this period, uh, 1600 to 1612, Shakespeare, was still going strong. He wrote some of his greatest plays. Hamlet, which debuted in 1600, Othello 1603, King Lear 1605, Macbeth 1606, The Winter's Tale somewhere in 1610, 1611, The Tempest 1611, 1612. We don't have definite dates for those plays. So Shakespeare, as the 17th century begins, is at the top of his game. The best tragic playwright of the early 17th century, besides Shakespeare, was this writer named John Webster, who lived between 1580 and 1625. John Webster grew up in London. He was the son of a tailor. He was possibly a law student at one point. Otherwise, we don't know much about his life. In this poem written in the 20th century by the great modernist poet T.S. Eliot, the poem is called Whispers of Immortality. Eliot wrote this of Webster. He said that Webster was much possessed by death and saw the skull beneath the skin. Webster's two major plays are The White Devil, first staged in 1612, and The Duchess of Malfi from 1613. They're notable, among other things, for having elements of Gothic horror. They're extremely dark and bloody revenge plays that are set in Italian courts. And their major theme, Webster's grand theme, moral corruption. In the 18th, in the 19th century, and even some of the 20th century, Webster was dismissed as sadistic, as a sensationalist. But if you really look at this work, the poetry and the characterization in his plays, in particular those two major plays, The White Devil and The Duchess of Malfi, the poetry and the characterization are stunning. He was very much influenced by Shakespeare, but he found his own voice. And it was the voice of a writer who sought to incorporate, uh, Gothicism, what later came to be called Gothicism, into his stories. These plays also have very strong female characters, and I recommend both of them. The Duchess of Malfi is found in our text, the Norton Anthology. So that's the greatest tragic writer, other than Shakespeare, in the early 17th century. The greatest writer of comedy, besides Shakespeare, was Ben Jonson, who lived between 1572 and 1637. Ben Jonson grew up in Westminster. He was the son of a clergyman who died before Ben's birth. And early in his life, Ben was apprenticed to be a bricklayer, which was his stepfather's profession. But he was awarded a scholarship. As an adolescent, he was awarded a scholarship to attend Westminster School. And there he studied under this great teacher named William Camden, and he fell in love with classical literature. For a time, Jonson was a soldier, and then returning to England, he became an actor. He killed another actor in a duel, an actor named Gabriel Spencer, who worked for the Admiral's Men. And finally, as the 1590s came to an end, Ben found his true calling as a playwright. Whereas Shakespeare's comedies are, for the most part, romantic comedies with some satire mixed in, with some tragedy mixed in, Jonson wrote pure satiric comedies. he mastered the subgenre of what is called the intrigue comedy. Comedies built around complicated conspiracies involving con men, Johnson calls knaves, and their victims, Johnson frequently calls gulls. He had his first big success in 1598 with Every Man in His Humor, and he reached his peak, his creative peak, in the 10-year period in which he wrote the plays Volpone in 1606, found in our Norton Anthology, Epicene, 1609, The Alchemist, 1610, and Bartholomew Fair, 1614. The last of these three plays are set in contemporary London, and their success helped popularize another comic subgenre, a subgenre called the city comedy. City comedies are set in the streets, shops, and public houses of London. As the critic Jill Levinson has observed, they satirize urban life by sharply focusing on its preoccupations with finance, power, and inevitably sex. So this was a genre of comedy that really Shakespeare didn't touch in his career. It really emerges first with Ben Jonson's plays. Uh, Another important point about Ben Jonson, he was the one prominent English playwright of this period who did very consciously follow the classical dramatic principles that were advocated by the Renaissance humanist scholars like Scaliger, Calavetro, and Sidney. And he made it work. He made it work in his comedies. He wrote some tragedies. The two tragedies he wrote were Sejanus and Catiline. And they are, I would say, failures because he tried too hard to make them classical. But he brought his knowledge of classical literature to the intrigue comedy, the city comedy, and the result were among the greatest plays that ever took to the English stage in any period. Well, in 1616, the year Johnson very audaciously self-published his collected works, Shakespeare. Shakespeare, who was 4 or 5 years into his retirement, died in his hometown of Stratford. In 1619, the great actor Richard Burbage, I talked about Richard Burbage a great deal. Richard Burbage passed away. He was replaced in The King's Men by a new lead actor named Joseph Taylor, who eventually became the manager of the playing troupe. Taylor won acclaim for his performances of Hamlet. Burbage originated the role. Taylor took over the role in 1619. There was another important member of the King's Men of Shakespeare's company in this period, Nathan Field. Nathan Field began his career as a boy actor, working for the Children of the Revels, the children company playing group. An actor named John Shank played the clown roles starting around 1615 until his death in 1634. The playwrights in the period after Shakespeare's retirement and death, John Fletcher. John Fletcher became the principal playwright for the King's Men. Fletcher wrote all types of plays, but specialized in tragicomedy. Fletcher often collaborated with, and after Fletcher's death in 1625, was succeeded by Philip Massinger. Philip Massinger is now best known for his satiric comedies, but he also wrote tragedies. Tragedies that, like Webster's, show a debt to Shakespeare. So the King's Men continued to reform after the deaths of Shakespeare and Burbage at the Globe Theatre. The original Globe Theatre actually burned down on June 29th, 1613. It was rebuilt and reopened by the following year. Starting in 1609, the King's Men performed at the Globe during the summer times but during the winter, they performed at the Blackfriars Theatre. Mentioned Blackfriars Theatre when I discussed the tradition of the boy actors and the children's companies. The Blackfriars Theatre was a converted monastery used from 16 to 1608 by the particular children's company known as the Children of the Chapel. It was an artificially lit theater, and it was located in a wealthy area of London, but it wasn't under the direct jurisdiction of civic authorities. It was considerably smaller than the Globe, but the admission prices were as much as 5 times higher. So the Blackfriars Theatre and other indoor theaters that popped up in the first decades of the 17th century attracted a more elite clientele. Early moderns eventually began to refer to the amphitheaters, that is, the theaters like the Globe and the Rose and the Fortune and the Swan, as public theaters, and the indoor playhouses like the Blackfriars as private theaters. The King's Men, as I said, they continued to perform in spring and summer at the Globe, wintertime at the Blackfriars, still touring the provinces, and during the Christmas season, appearing at the Royal Court. During this period, the King's Men had one major competitor, Queen Henrietta's Men, a troupe that was managed by a former actor named Christopher Beeston. And this troupe performed at an amphitheater playhouse known as the Red Bull and an indoor theater known as the Phoenix, which Beeston owned. And so as we move into the 1620s and then into the 1630s, Shakespeare's plays continued to be staged, as did Christopher Marlowe's plays, Dr. Faustus and the Jew of Malta, and even Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy, the first great adaptation of Seneca in the 16th century theater. In the 1630s, the King's Men apparently staged only 4 new plays per year. So 80% of their performances were of plays written in previous decades, including the plays written by Shakespeare. So while the theater continued to prosper financially, if not creatively, England in the 1630s was about to undergo one of its most devastating political crises. Got to go back to understand what happened in the 1630s and the early 1640s. You have to go back to 1603 and Elizabeth I. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth died without an heir. Queen Elizabeth was the granddaughter of Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, who is depicted in Shakespeare's play Richard III. She was the last of 5 monarchs of Britain belonging to the House of Tudor. Her reign had begun in 1558. So when she died in 1603, this was the only monarch that Shakespeare had ever known. Shakespeare was born, like Marlowe, in 1564. Historians have, in recent decades, reassessed Elizabeth's reign. So there's been some historical revisionism, but I think it remains the case that Queen Elizabeth I is still considered England's greatest monarch. Elizabeth she never married, never had children, and upon her death, she was succeeded by her cousin, the reigning King of Scotland, James VI, who upon taking the English throne became King James I. He was the first English monarch belonging to the House of Stuart, the Stuart family. James is now best known for sponsoring the English translation of the Bible for the Anglican Church, generally called the King James Bible. It ultimately became a powerful unifying force for Protestantism. But overall, King James never came close to matching the popularity of Queen Elizabeth. James overspent, went into debt, increased taxes. James had absolutist tendencies. I talked about absolutism in connection with Creon, right, in Sophocles' Antigone. Absolutism, political absolutism, refers to this idea that the king is above the law. The king is answerable only to God, and the king is God's deputy on earth. And this ideology of political absolutism prevailed in many parts of Europe in the 16th century and going into the 17th century. More on that when I discuss France and Moliere. In England, though, you had this monarch, Elizabeth, who reigned for so many years. And while some absolutist ideas appealed to her, at the end, she was a constitutional monarch. At the end of the day, she knew how to compromise. And in a very important respect, she was a winner. She was a winner. This 25-year-old woman who assumed the throne in a country that was falling apart, that by the end of her reign had become this major power in Europe, having defeated Spain very famously uh, in 1588. She was a winner, and rightfully or not, the English tended to perceive James as a loser. Uh, he had conflict after conflict with the increasingly wealthy and legal-minded House of Commons in Parliament. Uh, Now, James was also a lover of theater. As I mentioned several lectures ago, when he became king in 1603, he became the patron of Shakespeare's company, the Shakespeare Burbage Company, the Chamberlain's Men, who at that point became the King's Men. Well, James died in 1625, and James was succeeded by his son Charles, who became King Charles I. Charles had an intensely authoritarian and hierarchical vision. He was even more of a would-be absolutist than his father. He dissolved Parliament in 1629. At that time, the monarch could do that. He dissolved Parliament and ruled without Parliament until 1640. The fact that Charles was married to a French Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria, who sponsored her own acting company, angered many of Charles's Protestant subjects. Charles's religious policies put him at odds, especially with the Puritans of England. I mentioned the Puritans in the second lecture on Twelfth Night. Remember, Malvolio is called A Kind of Puritan by Maria. The Puritans were the extreme Protestants who rejected the Anglican hierarchy, who rejected many of the rituals of the Church of England, and who sought to morally reform English society. They hated the theater almost as much as they hated bishops, and came to hate King Charles I. Well, Charles I finally did recall Parliament in 1640. He did so in order to fund a war against Scotland, which was in revolt. Charles had bankrupted the state at that point. It was said that, James and Charles both spent more money in peacetime than Elizabeth ever spent in wartime. Well, 1640, Parliament agreed to grant funds to Charles only if he agreed in turn to limit his power. And significantly, the Parliament's most ardent supporters and much of the membership of Parliament were Puritans. Well, Charles consented to many of Parliament's demands, but he rejected several of the most important demands that Parliament had confronted him with. And then in 1641, Charles attempted to arrest 5 parliamentarians for treason. And there was this back and forth, this political game that was being played that had very deadly consequences in 1640, 1641, and then in 1642. In 1642, the London militia and the parliamentary supporters took over London. They took over London. Charles left London, and in August 1642, he raised his battle staff in Nottingham, and that began the English Civil War. So meanwhile, back in London, on September 2nd, 1642, the Puritan-dominated Parliament issued the following edict. I will read to you the highlights of this edict. It reads as follows. The distracted state of England, threatened with a cloud of blood by a civil war, calls for all possible means to appease and avert the wrath of God. It is therefore thought fit and ordained by the Lords and Commons in this Parliament assembled, that, while these set causes and set times of humiliation continue, the humiliation of a civil war, public stage plays shall cease and be forborne. So the theaters were shut down and plays became illegal. It was this moment where there were 80 years that built up to this moment. So remember, back in Shakespeare's day, the harshest critics of the theater companies and the theaters themselves and the playwrights were the Puritans, and now they had power in London. So plays were banned in 1642, and in 1644 the Globe Theatre was torn down, soon to be replaced by tenements. So the era in which English theatre flourished, the era that began when John Brain opened the Red Lion in the outskirts of London, in Shoreditch, the suburbs of London in 1567. That era had come to an inauspicious and very sad end with the dawning of this terrible period in the history of England, the period of the Civil War. There were actually 2 civil wars. Charles I, some of you probably know this, ended up being tried and executed in 1649. But that is a story for the next lecture. So the next video lecture that I'm going to do is on the Restoration and how theater, English theater, in a very different form, was reborn in 1660. So we will leave it there for now. There's a lot to digest in this lecture, the end of Twelfth Night, and neoclassical criticism, particularly involving the genre, as well as this background historical context to the early part of the 17th century and the end of the theater. So I will leave it there, and next time, the Restoration.